Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Dr. Charles Harry, who is the Director of Operations at the Maryland Global Initiative in Cybersecurity, an Associate Research Professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, and a Senior Research Associate at Center for International Security Studies at Maryland. He is also part of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Cyber Advisory Panel. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you very much.
I want to start with one of your articles, perhaps from a blog, integrating human and technical networks in organizational risk assessments, in which you say the U.S. government's recent efforts to ban the introduction of a specific foreign IT vendor's equipment in government networks is emblematic of the growing concern among organizational leaders posed by global supply chains, highlighting the broad interdependencies between technical and human systems. And you ask, how do we understand and measure the risk surface of human systems for our organizations? You want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, no, would be happy to. So one of the real challenges in the field of cybersecurity is less about very narrowly these technical problems. Don't get me wrong, they are a challenge, and we have a lot of really smart people working on those issues. But one of the areas that really has perplexed a lot of policymakers and organizational leaders, is this notion of complexity in their organization. So typically when we talk about vulnerabilities in systems, we're talking about a single device. Maybe it's a Windows box, maybe it's Linux, and there are vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities can be exploited. And so that's great. We tend to focus on kind of that single instance. But the problem is that when you look at how technology is actually leveraged in organizations and more broadly in an entire society, it's not just one device, it's millions of devices that are all networked together. And then there are humans that use those particular devices, and those devices themselves support human processes like manufacturing tires or an automobile or operating a customer service line. Yeah. And so this interface between technology and human processes is really the crux of the cyber problem. And it's this broader complexity in how you measure it and measure potential risk that is absolutely critical. And we see that both in the private sector and the public sector, that there really has been a growing awareness over the last 10 years of the importance of risk-based approaches to cybersecurity.
Yeah. So just like the robotics, automated systems, humans tend to be, as you know, the weak link in the process. And we can get the world's greatest technology, highly automated, highly specialized, But if it requires a human input in the process, that becomes the weakest link, right?
Correct, right. And it becomes really difficult for the defender to understand kind of where the seams are in their defense. So, um, it could be that you are pretty well defended in part of your network, but either exploit a human weakness that is tied to a particular organizational process that maybe you didn't account for. And that could potentially expose, $100 million worth of risk to an organization, or if you're a society and you have a potential disruption to a key service or organization, it could lead to large scale failures in an entire critical infrastructure sector. And so I think that's the real challenge that uh, beyond looking at just a specific business, that policymakers have, which is how do I begin to understand the enormity of the problem in an entire critical infrastructure sector when you have millions upon millions of devices that work together with humans to do important things. How do I assess that? How do I measure it? How do I categorize the range of effects? How do I measure severity? These are all fundamental questions that are not well settled right now in the industry.
Yeah.
And frankly, is really the role of academics right now to try to explore that space.
So what's the trend here, Charlie? Artificial intelligence is improving quite dramatically. Is the trend toward more autonomous information technology infrastructure, essentially remove the human content in it, or it's not that easy?
Well, so it's certainly automation and advanced analytics, and really the promise that AI brings is greater efficiency in a number of different systems, whether it's advanced manufacturing or it's in something like a smart city. I think the clear trend in the 21st century is greater adoption of technology, greater adoption of advanced analytics. That's clearly where we're heading. New standards like 5G are going to help enable that. The challenge, I think, for leaders, both in the public and private sector, is how do you manage the security concerns, but really take advantage of all the beneficial aspects that artificial intelligence and the smart infrastructure of the 21st century really provides.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like the idea. You call it the risk surface of human systems. So it is really the interface of technology and human systems. That's where most of the problems exist, right?
Correct. And that's exactly where my research focuses in on is how do you map that surface? How do you measure it? How do you categorize certain sub elements to it? And it's really what begins to emerge is the combination of kind of this intersection between devices themselves and with their humans and human processes, but it's part of a larger what we call complex systems framework where you get these kind of individual movements that are happening and individual things that occur at the system level, but then you get these emergent phenomenon that can come out of such a complex system that create real problems. And the challenge for humans is can we begin to understand what those emergent effects are, and if we do, then we can start to devise better defensive approaches to try to get that under control.
Yeah. I don't know if this is the right way to think about it, Charlie. Because the slope of the technology is quite high. So 5G is coming. Better artificial intelligence analytics is coming. This would require organizations to continuously fine tune, change, rebuild their IT systems too, right? So as you sort of flip legacy systems, you're introducing a high level of risk, I would imagine.
Absolutely, and the risk surface changes, right? So if you go from kind of a 20th century model of a client server setup with a kind of the older Oracle database, and you've got client machines that are interacting with it, and you now move to a more modern approach where you've got cloud-based infrastructure, where there's now an entire ecosystem of servers that are working together to allow for things like streaming analytics and doing that real-time analysis, the surface, the number of devices that you're using increases. Therefore, the attack surface opens up, and the complexity of how they interact changes dramatically. And then when you think about how those are dispersed geographically, now they're sitting in data centers that might be halfway around the world, leveraging internet-based infrastructure, and so it opens up yet more attack venues and avenues of potentially disrupting your business. So the word of the day here is complexity, but that really is it, and I think it's a real challenge for the operations manager in the future.
Right. Yeah, both systems and humans are distributed geographically, right? So it, on the positive side, it gives some redundancy, but on the other hand, it increases complexity and possibly increases the risk.
Correct, right. And that's, I think, the real challenge is that I think conceptually, business managers understand this. They live it every day. The challenge is how do you actually compute it and try to address it in a fairly scientific way, and that could actually be really difficult, even for people who are well resourced and who have the motivation to do so.
Yeah. I want to go into another article that you have, how to prioritize strategic risks that affect critical infrastructure. So you say many organizations are struggling with how to assess the broad set of risks stemming from cyber attacks against the nation's critical infrastructure. Roughly 85% of the critical infrastructure in the US is managed and operated by private organizations. And if ours is one of those, basically, if yours is one of those firms, you have the primary responsibility for assessing specific vulnerabilities and managing cybersecurity risks to your own network. So it's an entire sort of interaction with a plethora of privately managed systems that makes it extremely complex, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. This problem really stems, or I should say is well articulated in the 2018 U.S. Cyber Strategy, where they explicitly call out this idea of national risk. How do you estimate risk in critical systems? And so the article that you're citing really tries to highlight that while there's broad agreement across industry and across the public sector that strategic cyber risk is a issue and that risk in critical systems is certainly a issue. How to actually do so, how to actually try to understand that in a meaningful way is a gap. The Department of Homeland Security has specifically cited this as an area that needs additional work. And so the ability to understand how individual private organizations, you noted the 85% of critical infrastructure in the United States is managed by the private sector. And so how do all those various individual organizations work together to provision a service? So for instance, you can think of something like airlines and air transport in the United States. There are hundreds and hundreds of airports all around the United States. Some are extremely large, some are pretty small, but they're all part of the air transportation network. And when you look at the number of individually run airlines in conjunction with some oversight, depends on the airfield, by state and local government and the private operators. So one way we can think about this issue of complexity and strategic risk is to look at something like the air transportation sector. So the air transportation sector in the United States consists of hundreds, if not thousands, of airports. Those airports are geographically distributed. They're run by different organizations. There's interactions with the federal government, state and local governments. And all of those operators have their own processes, which are tied to their own IT systems. And so when you think about how aircraft take off from airports and land at other airports, they're supported by this complete orchestra of IT systems that have to work together. Right. And so if the communications tower network goes down at Los Angeles Airport, you may not have the ability to take off or land at that airport. And so what could start off as, let's say, a router going down in a key part of the network could disrupt a human process. That human process then leads to the inability for planes to take off or land, which then affects and cascades through the entire air transportation system, right? It leads to additional delays. It reduces flight capacity out of particular regions in the U.S. And so it's important when you think about strategic risk from cyber that you understand that while the attacks occur on specific devices, servers, laptops, routers, they can quickly cascade through these human processes. And that's the real challenge of measuring strategic risk.
Yeah, so the issue, if I were to diagnose this, Charlie, so there is no standardization. 85% of the critical infrastructure is managed by different private companies, and clearly a private company does not have infinite resources to assure that there are no risks, but it has to essentially communicate with variety of other infrastructures built and managed by other companies, right? So is it a sort of a lack of standardization, or how would you, if you were to start from start with a blank sheet of paper, how would you lessen this risk?
Yeah, this is a huge challenge, and a lot of people in the field, they both understand the enormity of the challenge and are trying to take some proactive, steps to address it. So, several years back, the Obama administration, authored an executive order that eventually led to the NIST cybersecurity framework, which was in essence a way to try to standardize or create some generalizable principles and best practices in how to manage the cybersecurity problem in critical infrastructure. That process was the identification of risk and risk management. And what you find in that framework are some really good general principles. However, when you delve into the framework, and this is not really a criticism of the framework, it's not really what it was meant for, but there are limits. They never actually tell you how to compute risk, and they kind of leave that to the specific operator, and that becomes a problem when you want to try to compare risk across organizations.
Right. Yeah, it becomes a resource problem too. So if you don't have any quantification, there is no prioritization, and hence you might be dealing with things that might be marginally important, but you may be leaving out much bigger things, right? If you don't really have a quantification of risk.
That's absolutely right, and so it becomes a real challenge for a lot of the federal agencies who are concerned about these things. So DHS and CISA, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, they're deeply concerned about strategic risks, and they have these concepts called national critical functions, and they're trying to quantify so they can best allocate scarce federal resources to maybe assist these operators in strengthening their systems. And what becomes interesting is this notion that you have private companies that make private decisions, right, about whether to do certain things or not do certain things. And there could be public level consequences, right? So if you choose not to patch that server, which leads to, let's say, a ransomware deployment that shuts down a critical system, and then now let's say you can't move natural gas from one part of your pipeline infrastructure to another, you could potentially lead to problems, downrange, and maybe impact power generation, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the real challenge in this field is how do I start to link up what is, oftentimes, very myopic, very highly focused on the single technical system, but take a systems engineering approach and look at these larger consequences.
Right. Yeah. And obviously, from a private company perspective, the decisions that they make is sort of maximizing shareholder value, and that gets into what kind of insurance they might be holding, and how they may have externalized that risk, that public risk, that they may not be ultimately responsible for. And so the question from a system perspective is there a pot of risk out there that nobody is really accountable for managing? And that risk, if it gets big enough, could potentially have a huge impact on society.
That's absolutely right. I think a really good example of that is not the NotPetya ransomware attack of a couple years back. And one of the targets that it ended up hitting was Maersk Line, which is the largest container ship company in the world.
Yeah.
And Maersk, there were thousands of devices that were affected by NotPetya, but it was just a handful of servers that ended up directly affecting their container management system in several large ports, including the port of Rotterdam, which is the largest container ship port in Europe. And so what that ended up leading to was 7 to 14 days where they couldn't move containers in and out of the yard, which means that a lot of the supply chains, especially in Central Europe, in Germany in particular, were highly disrupted. So now you've got, car companies, you've got chemical companies, you've got other firms that are now, seeing supply chain problems that creates larger societal impacts.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I want to jump into another paper, Charlie. This is so it's entitled "An Effect-centric Approach to Assessing the Risks of Cyber Attacks Against Digital Instrumentation and Control Systems at Nuclear Power Plants." But you say cyber attacks against the digital instrumentation and control systems in nuclear power plants are of grave security concern. Um, so I was in engineering a long time ago, Charlie, and I was part of the team that qualified the Comanche Peak nuclear power plant south of Fort Worth
Oh.
in the late 80s. In the late 80s. And, obviously technology has changed quite a bit from the 80s. But change in technology doesn't really help us, right, from a risk perspective. Why don't you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so that paper in particular, we worked with a nuclear engineer out of Lawrence Livermore. Well, he's retired from Lawrence Livermore, but a really, really well-informed nuclear power engineer who really helped us think through how both kind of older systems in nuclear power plants and some of the newer digital systems that are being implemented, with trying to identify what some of the potential risks and what risks, frankly, don't exist in something like a nuclear power plant. What in essence we're trying to do with a lot of the research that we've been working on is to try to tampen down on some of the hysteria. Oftentimes you read news articles and people say, well, we have to worry about cyber attacks, blacking out the entire United States, and it could be done by a 12-year-old, right? And that's just not really feasible for a lot of different reasons. And one of the things that people like to talk about are nuclear power plants and engineering nuclear meltdowns. And what people oftentimes don't realize is, there's a lot of safety engineering that goes into these systems, as you might imagine. Right. And so what we were trying to do in that paper was to systematically go through and highlight that, where there really might be a risk, and yet not a lot of benefit for actually making it digital. So we specifically focused on parts of that process where we said, well, the actual, efficiency benefit you gain from digitizing this component is really not all that great. And you're better off leaving it in either as an analog system or a manual process to create, in essence, a fire break so that you don't see these catastrophic effects. And the idea was to really start to apply, our approach to risk to create those trade-offs, to say, in some cases, we might be better off with a manual system or an analog system as opposed to completely digitizing it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like you say, the nuclear power plants is probably pretty well protected. They are, reasonably highly autonomous systems with a lot of safety and redundancy. uh, when we were designing that plan, we had to actually design the containment for aircraft hits and things like that. This is in the late 80s, and these things have very, very high factors of safety, and that's why it becomes quite expensive to build them. But I think the risk might be coming from more from a technology perspective, right? So,
Yes.
this goes back to our earlier discussion, which is as technology changes, as operators and companies are forced to change legacy systems into newly arriving technologies, that is where I think a lot of the risk is going to materialize.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. A good example might be autonomous vehicles. So the vehicles themselves, there's kind of a range of, I guess, quality code and hardening of code. But I'm less concerned about a broad-based hacking of devices over, let's say, GSM infrastructure. And I think what's much more likely to occur in an area of risk that maybe people don't think about is all the roadside infrastructure that will also be required for more autonomous driving. So if you
Hmm.
imagine a world 20, 30 years from now where there is autonomous vehicles, it's not just about the cars, it's about all the smart traffic lights, it's about the guardrails that are going to have sensors, and the cars no doubt will interact with some of that infrastructure as part of a broad traffic management program. And we already see a lot of the protocols for that being developed.
Yes.
So in my mind, the real risk is not necessarily on the hard target, which is your Tesla or whatever the new electric car is 30 years from now. Because they may have actually done a relatively good job of locking things down and being able to very quickly patch vulnerabilities, but it might be all that municipally owned infrastructure, that small town, somewhere in the United States that doesn't have a lot of resources to constantly keep this infrastructure patched and
Hmm.
updated. And I think that's where you're going to start seeing more risk in an area of future technology.
Yeah, yeah. I want to go into one of your recent articles. I think, I don't know if it came out or just recently came out, the challenge of assessing strategic cybersecurity risk in organizations and critical infrastructure. Um, I don't have it in front of me, Charlie, but I remember you have devised some sort of a risk index, right? Some quantification of how to measure risk.
Yes. So we have a broad framework of analysis that we've developed, and part of that is a way to measure severity of attack and put it in this kind of complex system analysis that we've been talking a lot about. And so the paper you referenced was an article that explicitly tried to tie some of the policymaker goals with an approach to actually start breaking this problem down into more manageable chunks. And we have an approach, and we've done some analysis on various sectors. We're working on a paper now for the U.S. airline infrastructure, where we actually go through and we analyze what would an attack on both airports versus airlines really mean to both national and regional infrastructure. How do you quantify it? And there were some really surprising results that come out of that analysis, specifically localized effects versus national effects.
Mm.
Some areas of the country are more prone to disruption from the loss of a specific airport versus others. So, the analysis that we're able to do is, because we've been able to come up with an index that allows us to quantify basically the weighted disruption in these kind of complex systems.
Yeah, and so if I remember correctly, so you have, so if you think about the airline, U.S. Airline system, you have hubs, you have volume of people moving between airports, and so you can sort of come up with a network analysis, right? That basically says if I take a node out in that network, what would be the implication of that in the entire system? Something along those lines?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So what we're able to build are graph models, node edge models, where we are in essence able to string together, in the case of airlines, airports with passenger volumes, and so we create in essence a large graph structure, and then we're able to estimate based on the position of the node in the graph, what we call centrality, coupled with kind of the weighted edge weights around it. So the volumes of people going in and out of the airport. And we're able to derive basically a weighted disruption value. And we basically anchor it between 0 and 1, 0 meaning no disruption, 1 being full disruption of the graph structure. So what we're trying to do is take a lot of different dimensions and distill it down to a single number that gives people at least a sense, to a way to think about, percentage of weighted disruption from an attack. And we're able to apply that, in a regional context. So we can look at it by FEMA region, or we can look at it nationally. And then we do the same thing with airlines, where now we're taking the capacity out of the market instead of taking down an airport. And that's where we start finding some really interesting results when you compare the two.
Yeah. So, for example, COVID-19 effects, you could analyze what the effect of that might be on the system as well, right?
Correct.
If you were to, it's kind of a demand shock
Correct.
on the system. And so have you done that?
So I actually did some back of the envelope math for another presentation, and we looked at that. We just had some preliminary numbers on changes of U.S. air demand, and so as you might imagine, COVID was really quite significant in terms of, if you want to call it a disruption, but we can apply the exact same analytic method to do so. And we were able to, demonstrate a very, very large effect, from February to March, March to April, and April to May. I don't have the numbers exactly in front of me, but I want to say it was on the order of, as we move from March into April, the weighted effect that we saw, let's say at like LAX, was roughly like a 0.35, 0.4. So and so there's some nuance in how to kind of interpret that number, but because the airport was still functioning, even though 80% of the traffic volume was down, doesn't mean that it was completely disrupted, because the network itself is still intact. But to your point, it's a demand shock. And so, that it is still very consequential. But the way that we weight our index shows that it was highly consequential, but it does not mean the entire network falls apart. And there's a difference between that and, let's say a cyber event, where you actually shut down the actual ability for the airport to function.
Yeah. I mean, this is a design question ultimately. So, one could argue that it's a trade-off between, let's say, efficiency/cost against redundancy / security in some ways, right? So
Yeah.
I could design a system with a single hub at the center of the country, and I might actually garner a lot of efficiency by doing that. On the other end of the spectrum, I could have all, sort of small local airports, moving back and forth between themselves. So I have a very high redundancy in the system. There cannot be any major disruption, even if you take a few nodes out. And so we obviously have the status quo, but as we look forward from a design perspective, what would you say we should be thinking about? How would, again, if you were to have a blank sheet of paper today for the US design, what would you prefer to do there?
Well, no, I think you really raised an excellent question. And, certainly the air infrastructure in the U.S. is primarily focused around major hubs. There's, figure about 10 major hubs around the country. And it is, in essence, just the network structure itself lends itself to redundancy, in the sense that if you take down one node, it's really not catastrophic. I mean, it's bad for that area. even if you take down a large, hub like Chicago O'Hare or Atlanta.
Yeah.
But the air network structure itself is still highly resilient. And in that case, it's very similar to the internet. Where they're highly vulnerable, however, is if you have coordinated attack, right? So if you coordinate and take down not just one major hub, but let's say 4 or 5 or 6, then you could have a really serious problem, and you start to fracture the ability for the network not to move within a region, but oftentimes between regions. So that's the kind of the core problem that you see in air transportation networks, and it's very similar to other networks, including the internet. So I think if you're talking about how to design, greater resiliency, and I think you're spot on about this being a trade-off between, kind of, operational efficiency and resiliency and security. So the way that you would probably need to think about it is, okay, let's come up with the optimum model for efficiency, but then
Yes.
there might have to be public sector investments to ensure some amount of resiliency. Obviously, it's not feasible for every airport in the United States to be connected to one another, but it might make sense for some secondary airports to have some capacity to move to other major hubs directly. And I think that might be a more optimal solution. So it's more about public investment in infrastructure as maybe a way to resolve the resiliency problem. And this applies not just to cyber, but you could say the same thing for climate change and other challenges that we're facing in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's such an interesting problem. I haven't really thought about it, Charlie, but there could also be coupled risk, right? So if you take about the middle of the country, Chicago, Atlanta, Dallas, if you had a coordinated attack, we could potentially compute what the effects would be if it's Chicago plus Atlanta as opposed to Chicago plus Dallas, right? Because it's different airlines and different structural elements there. And then, what you're saying, I think, is it possible to have some sort of on-demand capacity to come online in case something happens?
Well, so I mean, with regard to your first point, absolutely, and we do that analysis to look at not just single attacks on airports, but we can actually quantify multiple, kind of simultaneous events. So the way to kind of handle that is on demand. I think you have to start thinking about that and plan for that contingency. But the challenge for that, of course, is if you have on demand capability, well, then that's inventory that's not being used, right? And it's not efficiently allocated. And so in the airline industry, which is highly competitive, of course, and probably runs on fairly thin margins, is this something that they would look to the U.S. government to, in essence, provide a subsidy to maintain? So they may be willing to say, well, for the broader public critical infrastructure, we're willing to do it, but we want a tax break. And I think that's where more creative public policy making needs to be done. It's to think in a more systems type approach to say, okay, where does it make sense for us to make critical investments, so that in understanding why the private sector is doing what it's doing, we don't want to paint them as the bad guy. They're trying to make money. That's the goal of any business.
Yeah.
But understanding that there's a public concern around this, well, then we need to make investments, and that's what, frankly, good governance is all about. And is one of the things that I try to impart upon my students is, it's where the goal here is not to make it private versus public. There's a public sector concern that stems from entities, whether they're civilians and citizens of the country, or you're actually talking about corporations that have to work together. So understanding the system dynamics is absolutely critical for good governance.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely agree. So if you look forward 5 years, Charlie, in conclusion, the sense I get is we have a lot of risks that we have to manage. there is some structural issues, such as 85% of the critical infrastructure managed by private companies. There is no real standardization of the equipment and the technologies that they're using. So a lot of coordination risks there. So if you look forward 5 years, what would you say, sort of the top three policy priorities should be in this area?
Oh, well, so first of all, I think there needs to be a better way to identify risk and to measure it. I think before we start going down the path of, any additional policy making or law making in this area, I think it's helpful to just have an understanding and a central modeling capability that
Yeah.
allows our policymakers to make well-informed decisions, right? So I think that's, kind of I'm not sure if you call it number one, but I would say that I would put it way at the top of my list. The second piece of this, it maybe, it might take some people by surprise. I think we need to educate the next generation of policymaker, right? And policy
Right.
analysts, right? On technology. Now, the goal is not to make them electrical engineers or computer engineers or data scientists. However, they need to be fluent in the language. They need to broadly understand how the internet works, how advanced data analytics work, the both the advantages of using them as well as some of the challenges
Right.
that we run into. And stemming from that, you get all the questions of privacy, of course, and resiliency in the case of significant disruption. But there's this education component to a group in our country that frankly struggles, and all of us have seen those testimonies on Capitol Hill where very, very few of those lawmakers probably deeply understand what a lot of the technology leaders are trying to tell them. And it's not that the technology leaders are evil and want to pull one over on the public sector. I don't buy into that.
Yeah.
What I do buy into is that it's complicated, and but that's not an excuse. that means
Right.
we need to improve, the understanding of our lawmakers. So that would be number two, and then the third would be I would say a tighter coupling between the private and the public sector. So
Yeah.
as we're moving forward to this much more integrated and complex society in the 21st century, we will be able to achieve so much in this next century. It is truly exciting. However, with that comes a set of risks, and those risks need to be better understood, not just by the public sector, but also by the private sector, and how they work together so that the private sector understands how they can make certain decisions that have large scale societal consequences. And, I just firmly believe that businesses do have, in addition to, the profit motive, also want to be good corporate citizens.
Yeah.
Of course, there are always the one or two examples, but in general, when you talk to CEOs and you talk to boards, they understand that they're part of a society, right? Like they live in it. Their kids, live in that society. So they want it to be safe as well. So I think finding better ways to integrate the private and public sector is, I think, something that I would very much champion.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think, the first item that you said, once you have some sort of quantification, right, you could actually think about some kind of a reporting system around that. But it has to be standardized so that people can understand what each company in the network is holding on to from a risk perspective. And so, just like we think about financial reporting, you could have more of a standardized risk reporting in the future,
That
potentially.
that's right, and there are ways to communicate the risk that they're posing in a way that does not give up any sort of corporate, secrets, and something that they're more readily able to share. The challenge for them always, of course, is that the more you make that public,
Mm.
then it potentially affects things like insurance rates and other costs that they have to operate with. And
Right.
so of course, there's a natural inclination to kind of keep that, bottled up. So we've got to change that incentive structure, right? We've got to make it where, you want to share it. And maybe by by the fact that you are sharing and you're taking proactive steps, it demonstrates that, in fact, you are trying to be a good corporate citizen and moving in the right direction. And maybe therefore you are, potentially given a discount, or maybe this is where the private or the public sector is able to provide some cover. But again, this is why it's so important for the public and the private sector to work together, and why the public sector needs better training and education in this space, so they understand those complexities and understand the challenges to the businesses in this environment. Because without it, I fear that we're going to go down this road of kind of willful ignorance, where we think everything is okay until something really bad happens. And,
Right.
I think it's just much better to be proactive.
Yeah, it's too late by then. So that's the key. So this has been great, Charlie. Thanks so much for spending time with me, and good luck with all this work that you're doing in this area.
Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.